Welcome to Program 5 of Courtroom Communication Skills. This program is called Speaking Persuasively and will give you new tools to speak better as you think on your feet.
You are going to learn to speak in phrases, not whole sentences, to control your pace.
And to be persuasive, emphasize key words and gesture with inflection.
You're going to learn to sound decisive and confident by walking up and walking down the musical steps of inflection. Speaking persuasively requires that you coordinate your thinking brain with your speaking voice. And you're not only coordinating your brain with your speaking voice, but the listener's brain, because that's what persuasion is all about. So to make that coordination between brain and voice happen, we need to re-emphasize this notion of chunking, that our brains like information in chunks. Your listener's brains, your jurors' brains need information to be delivered in digestible chunks. So that's the permission we're going to give ourselves to speak in a particular way, because it's persuasion. It's not just casual conversation. You're trying to embed information into jurors' brains so they remember it and they find it credible. And sometimes that is complex information. So they need to be fed sometimes even more deliberately and even more slowly, one chunk at a time. But let's move out of this notion of chunking, which is not a particularly literary word, and give it a different word, which is phrasing. The way that we think and speak is not one word at a time. We do not think one word at a time. What we do when we're thinking or when we're speaking is we put words together in phrases, and eventually those phrases add up to an entire sentence. So now let's think of the chunk when we're speaking as a phrase. And that's the fundamental building block of persuasion. That is the digestible chunk of information. So let's think about phrasing when it comes to speaking and how incredibly important that phrasing is. But let's also now bring into this discussion the silence that we talked about during the time warp. Silence is when the persuasion happens. You may have heard one half, the latter half of the Swiss proverb, silence is golden. The first half of that proverb that we don't often hear is, words are silvern, but silence is golden. So we're trying to find both the silver word and the golden silence, because that's when the persuasion happens. So we're going to use phrasing to achieve that. So let's think about phrasing in speech for a while. Let's think about highly oratorical speech and how often that kind of delivery, the real orator holding forth, uses silence in a particularly dramatic way. Let's use as our first example Franklin Delano Roosevelt announcing the attack on Pearl Harbor. That's a speech that every December 7th comes back around, and you might hear at least a portion of it on the news. You certainly can go listen to it on YouTube. How did he deliver that? Well, given the importance of that announcement and the tragedy of that particular announcement, he said it like this, in phrases surrounded by lots of silence. He said, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy, the United States was suddenly and deliberately attacked by the air and naval forces of the Empire of Japan. Well, that's one example of using silence as an orator. Let's use another example. What about Abraham Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address? 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Well, one can imagine in that oratorical moment using those silences in that kind of dramatic way. Now, granted, in the courtroom, you're not engaged in the kind of oratory that FDR or Abraham Lincoln was using, but silence has a very important place. So we're going to boil this entire instruction down to coordinate brain and voice, to use the silence, to speak in phrases, to make the chunks digestible for the learner, to this simple expression. If you want to be persuasive, speak in phrases, not whole sentences. Listen to that again, and listen to how I'm so deliberately chopping up a single sentence into 3 obvious phrases. If you want to be persuasive, speak in phrases, not whole sentences. Say that with me in exactly that rhythm. Here we go. If you want to be persuasive, speak in phrases, not whole sentences. And when you think about that, when do we speak in phrases? In other words, where in your brain might you already have the speedometer perfectly set to do precisely that? Well, we speak in phrases when we speak together. Think how every person in the United States of America saying the Pledge of Allegiance says it exactly the same way. In fact, say with me just the first sentence of the Pledge of Allegiance, because we are both going to say it with exactly the same rhythm. Here we go. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. That's the rhythm we're after. In fact, let's think of it as rhythm. Let's turn those words, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, into a gibberish rhythm with just monosyllables of ba-bum-ba-dum-bum, dum-bum-bum, ba-ba-dum-bum-bum-bum-bum. But now let's take that rhythm and let's put this instruction to it. So that's the rhythm you can use to control the pace that you're speaking. Listen to that again. So that's the rhythm you can use to control the pace that you're speaking. Say that. So that's our first goal, is to say, I need to control the pace because I need to think and the jury needs to think and I need time and they need time and our brains like information in chunks. So we're going to boil it down to something that simple. Just like the Pledge of Allegiance, speak in phrases, not whole sentences.
Now that you know how to set the pace for your speech in the courtroom by speaking in phrases, not whole sentences, let's think about how to make those phrases the most interesting they can be, the most persuasive they can be. We're talking about persuasive speech after all. It's got to have something extra than just normal speech. As we work our way through each sentence in phrases, now we're going to take apart each phrase and figure out what can we do with it. What's going on inside each phrase, randomly selected by you, the speaker. What's going on is that there are 3 or 4 words in each phrase, and there are words in there that are important. In fact, as we instinctively phrase and speak our way through everyday conversation, we automatically choose the important words we're talking about, the words that make our point, and we give them extra oomph, extra emphasis. So we can actually make a rule here. Emphasize words within each phrase that give meaning to the phrase. So as we work our way through a sentence such as, she never promised the shipment would arrive by Tuesday, we can start to choose which words give the right meaning to that sentence. And we do that phrase by phrase. If we've made friends with silence, then we've got the moment between each phrase to decide what the attitude is. What word is most important? What's the situation here that warrants the emphasis? Let's just pick some random emphasized words in that one sentence. She never promised the shipment would arrive by Tuesday. We could say, she never promised the shipment would arrive by Tuesday. And that would mean that it wasn't her, it might have been somebody else, and that shipment, and Tuesday, really? Maybe Wednesday, probably Thursday or Friday. By the way we emphasize the words, the jurors understand your meaning. They want to know what your side of the case is, and you want to bring them over with you. And you do it phrase by phrase, and within each phrase, there are words that need to be emphasized. So as we work our way through a sentence, she never promised the shipment would arrive by Tuesday. We know that you're exasperated about this. We've heard it over and over in this case, and we can't believe opposing counsel is revisiting it again. So we can shift emphasis a phrase at a time by going slowly enough on the important stuff that the jury knows exactly what we're talking about. If it's too fast, she never promised the shipment would arrive by Tuesday. It just doesn't have the weight it needs. Of course, as you work your way through a case, language will ebb and flow. Sometimes it'll get faster, sometimes it'll slow down when you come to the really important stuff, or the difficult words, or the important people whose names you want us to remember. But you're making all these decisions on the fly. That's the beauty of language. You get to decide, if you've set the pace properly, what's important, and you can do it a phrase at a time. There's no rush to get to the end of any one sentence. You can work your way through it. Now, at the same time that you've set your pace so that you can emphasize the words inside of it, you're gesturing, as we have been for most of this course. Our hands know where the emphasis is. One reason we're so picky about gesturing, and we want you to get it right, is that we know our hands are encoded with the language. They know our meaning before we do. In fact, in gesture studies, we often find out that hands move before lips do. That tells us that our hand is selecting the language and fetching it before our lips actually say it into the air, until it is audible. Our hands already know. So we want to release our hands into the zone of gesture as we emphasize each phrase that we're speaking. And our hands automatically find the word that's important and give it an extra bump, an extra emphasis, so that our listeners know exactly what we mean. Gesturing is important not only because it helps you emphasize each phrase and the words inside of it, but because it almost can be the conductor. You can conduct yourself and set the pace by gesturing smoothly and slowly when you really need to. So you've got your hands going, you're finding the emphasis within each phrase, and then remember, within each phrase, there's one key word that deserves emphasis. So as you break down each of your phrases, there's going to be a word in there that gets extra emphasis. Just as in the sentence, she never promised the shipment would arrive by Tuesday. That was different emphasis than before, but all I needed to know was I should emphasize a key word in each phrase. So think of this mantra. In every phrase, emphasize at least one key word. In every phrase, emphasize at least one key word. The meaning changes according to the emphasis, but if you keep emphasis going inside each phrase, it works for you every time. You can use it in presentational speeches, openings, and summations, but you can also use it in questions. Officer Smith, what time did you say you came up on deck? What time did you say you came up on deck? All that phrasing has key words in each phrase. So it works with questions, and it also works in the rest of language as well. So remember, in every phrase, emphasize at least one key word.
We need to add one more instruction to your understanding of how to speak persuasively, and it has to do with punctuating, audible punctuating. Think about how important it is when you write to know how to punctuate properly. It's something we started to learn as small children. We learned that a sentence ends with a period, and a question ends with a question mark, and an exclamation has an exclamation mark. Well, think how important those symbols are on a printed page. Important for the reader to have some sense of that sentence is over, period. Or that's a question, and it has a question mark. Or that is an exclamation mark. There's an audible equivalent. In fact, I can demonstrate that audible equivalent by simply making noise. I don't even have to say a word, and you know what this noise means. Huh? Huh? Make that noise with me. Huh? It's obviously a question. Let's slow that noise down and analyze it a bit. Huh? I call that the questioning curl. Huh? In fact, I wonder if a question mark has that round shape in it, because that's the tone on its side that goes, huh? Huh? Right? True? Correct? It's the obvious sound of a question. Isn't that noise, huh, different from this noise? Huh. Huh. And there's something about going down, huh, that is more conclusory, like a period. Huh? Huh. And then this noise is something different. Huh. Huh. Exclamation mark. I'm suddenly up in a very high pitch. Huh. Wow. Well, let's apply those simple noises to the act of speaking and the inflective music of your voice. But I want to focus particularly on the period, because just as a writer, it's the most commonly used mark. And I suspect if you've ever been critiqued about your writing, no one has ever said to you, too many periods. Well, the same thing applies to speaking. You can never use too many audible periods. So let's examine this noise, that huh, the sense of going down, the finality achieved by that. Let's use another example that you already know. Say with me the final phrase of the Pledge of Allegiance, and we are all going to say it in exactly the same way, with liberty and justice for all. Here we go. With liberty and justice for all. And think about what our voices just did. We descended to a lower pitch, with liberty and justice for all. So I refer to that pattern, descending to a lower pitch, as walking down the steps, with liberty and justice for all, period. None of us ever go up, with liberty and justice for all, exclamation mark, or a question, with liberty and justice for all? It's not a question. So that audible period is the descending to a lower pitch inflective pattern. Another example you've heard a million times but never really thought about it. Every newscaster signs off indicating that they are done by that exact pattern. If I were a newscaster, I might say, Brian Johnson, ABC News, New York. And by the time I get to New York, I've walked down the steps, period. I'm done with that. It's so important for a couple of reasons. Number one, it is the sound of certainty. It makes you sound like you are absolutely sure. And so much about persuasion is that. It's a kind of reciprocal event. You go first as the counsel, and then maybe I'll believe it. But if I think you don't sound like you believe it, so why should I believe it if you as the lawyer don't believe it and you're the one saying it? So that is the sound of certainty. The other advantage of that audible period is literally it buys you time to think. And remember, we are engaged in this process we've come to call structured improvisation. So unlike an actor who knows exactly what the word is that I will say next because Shakespeare wrote it or Arthur Miller or David Mamet wrote it, I'm not sure what's next. And that descending pattern buys me time to think. Think about on the printed page, we come to the end of a sentence, period. There's a space, and then the new sentence begins with that capital letter. Well, that space is the silence that we are looking to preserve in this context. So that walking down the steps helps the listener identify that that chunk is over, period. When that chunk is over, you have a chance to think, what do I say next? Because that buys you a little time to think. So our goal is to now say, let's make what we're doing with our voices have all three components. Let's put it all together. Let's say, all right, I'm going to control my pace by speaking in phrases. As Marcia just demonstrated, I'm going to emphasize the key words, and that will unlock the meaning. In addition to speaking in phrases and emphasizing key words, I will walk down the steps. Put those together in one utterance, speak in phrases, emphasize key words, and walk down the steps. Now, let's also allow for this. Because it's persuasion, sometimes we can walk up the steps. Members of the jury, use your common sense. Doom, da doom, da doom. So there's a value in saying, well, we're trying to end conclusively. But I would say, just like in writing, certainly in legal writing, you're not going to overuse exclamation marks, but there is a place where that is appropriate, because that's what persuasion sounds like, which is very different than the questioning curl. So let's talk about that, because that's something to avoid. The questioning curl, or what we could call the uptick of inflection, or the uptick of uncertainty, let's just examine what happens when my voice keeps ending on that higher pitch. Well, number one, it sounds like everything I'm saying is a question, and it is pandemic in our culture that lots of people speak with that pattern on the end of almost every phrase. So everything that I'm saying sounds like I'm really not very certain, because my inflective pattern says that I'm really asking a question. So on the opening boilerplate, as you begin to address the court, be careful that you don't start with that questioning curl right from the very beginning. May it please the court. My name is Brian Johnson. Walk down the steps. May it please the court. My name is Brian Johnson. That's the way to immediately start that pattern. So it's 3 simple instructions. Speak in phrases, emphasize key words, and walk down the steps. Let's recap what you just learned. Talk to yourself and say, control your pace by speaking your first sentence in phrases. Say that and do that.
Hear the silence between phrases. Say that in phrases.
Gesture immediately and allow your hands to emphasize key words. Say that and do that with your hands.
To end your sentences decisively, walk down the steps. Say that.
Put all that together and you will be able to speak persuasively.